Join EWTN on this special on-location presentation as the Catholic University of America and the Napa Institute present Human Ecology, integrating business and 125 years of Catholic social doctrine.
Our next speaker is truly fascinating. Iqbal Quadir, who is from Bangladesh, has spent the vast majority of his adult life trying to make technologies, markets, and financial services, communications open to people of real low income. After his education, he returned to Bangladesh and started a company called Grameenphone. And Grameenphone goes into villages and tries to make, through a cell phone network, and makes the cell phone communications available to low-income people. Very, very low-income people for pennies can make the phone calls that they need to make, even all over the world. It now serves 55 million customers. So it's just a remarkably innovative technology. By the way, his TED Talk on this is terrific. You just go to TED Talk and put Iqbal Quadir on it. It's just remarkable. He also more recently started Bcash, which makes mobile financial services, available to low-income people. That's now doing 1 billion transactions among 22 million customers in Bangladesh and throughout the world. Mr. Quadir has been teaching for 4 years at Harvard University. He is now at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and comes with a real remarkable insight into how innovative technology can lead to inclusion. Let's welcome the most creative and remarkable Iqbal Quadir.
Thank you, Father.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
It's great to be at this beautiful university. Thank you very much, Father Spitzer. Thanks also to Professor Andreas Widmer, who we worked together a little bit in Boston before he came here to introduce me to the great university. As Father Spitzer said, I come from Bangladesh, and I will show you a little before I tell this Grameenphone story, that about 5 months ago, there was a report by Boston Consulting Group on Bangladesh. And I'll read a little bit of that. Bangladesh remains synonymous with poverty. It is time to take a new look at this land of 160 million people. This rapidly developing economy is one of the world's next great markets for discretionary consumption. Actually, the report starts saying that as you get out of the plane, you see the city throbbing with the bustling masses of people, bridges, expressway, this and that. So you see a lot of economic activities, and which is kind of a contrast to the usual image of it being a very low-income, poor country. Now, the question is, this growth market, discretionary consumption, these are phrases I'm picking up from the previous quote, rising disposable income, they attract businesses and consulting firms like BCG. But how do they happen? After it has happened, I understand BCG is taking an interest. But how did it happen is really what I want to talk about. And at least one of the contributors is cell phone, and that's the story I want to tell. But by the way, if you look at the picture of the BCG report, the rickshaw is loaded with smartphones. So they also probably get the point, which is why they have painted that picture, which is kind of funny. So basically, I wish to tell you a story of at least my thinking or philosophy as to how can the emerging markets actually emerge. I came to America 40 years ago. So the first 2 decades I spent in universities, at the World Bank, in the Wall Street, And generally speaking, I learned from these places that poor countries generally are poor because they don't have enough capital, and that rich countries can send that capital and allow them to grow up. This, by the way, I completely, generally disagree. But I will tell you that because I came from a country that didn't have much capital, I was always actually on the lookout for ways that you minimize the need for capital. That how can actual progress happen, okay? And I worked in Wall Street, I worked in the World Bank. I knew what they do, and I tried to learn that, how to get capital. But I also kept my mind open to how to rejuvenate a country without much capital. So I will tell you three. I'm also, like Mr. Wasserman, I'll also show you three insights that I collected. And they show how to minimize the use of capital. And actually, if you want to establish a business, you need to think about how to minimize capital. So one of them is Adam Smith. I actually was originally exposed to Adam Smith, and I later became a big fan of him, because he mentioned Bengal, which is the older name, an English name of Bangladesh. 2/3 of the old province of Bengal is Bangladesh. And he mentioned that there was great opulence, this is Adam Smith's language, in antiquity in Egypt, in Bengal, and eastern China. And he attributed that to inland navigation, because rivers and, if you are a river delta like Egypt and Bangladesh is an enormous river delta, lots of rivers, including the Ganges, of course. And that allows rudimentary boats to transport, and that, in his thesis of specialization and exchange, was facilitated naturally by inland navigation, because you need a bigger technologies and more sophisticated engineering to build ships to go out in the seas. So when you are at antiquity, when the technologies were poorer, inland navigation actually was a secret of success. And he brings that up in the context of justifying his main insight that specialization and exchange is the primary means of growth. So for example, he talked about the pin factory. He didn't say pour capital into it. He simply said that if you can specialize and exchange, then everybody gets better, and specialization means you become focused on something, and you become better at it and produce more, and you exchange, and then the overall productivity goes up. So basically, the points are that the specialization exchange actually has many positive attributes. I just list 4: higher productivity, as I said, or as you break down products into smaller areas, activities, you can innovate in that. You have a cooperation because you're exchanging, or you understand the needs of other people through these, and there are others. So specialization exchange is a key to economic growth, and that can give rise to capital, not that capital comes first and gives rise to economic growth. Another person is Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel. He pointed out in the mid-60s that every 2 years, the microprocessors are getting squeezed twice as much processing power getting into the same chips. He originally said it's 1 year, but later on people found it's 2 years. But basic point is correct. And in fact, this week's Economist is a cover article, is the future of computing, and he says ultimately the Moore's law seems to be running out, but it has been surviving and doing well for the last 50 years. The basic point, if you see this, I pointed out in this chart, that in 20 years, the number of processors on a chip goes up by 1,000 times. So in other words, you need less and less money, 1,000 to $1, for the same amount of processing power. In other words, you need less and less capital. So this is another insight that I learned from, which shows that not only specialization exchange is not necessarily requiring capital, but also if you do need some capital, that need is going down and down. And this we saw it happening in front of us in the 1980s or so, as big, mighty mainframes were being squeezed into computers. In fact, I tried to take computers to Bangladesh, thought this would be, but I didn't find it really interesting because even though the prices were going down, they were not have gone down enough, and the country had nearly 40% of the population was illiterate. They couldn't quite use computers, etc. The third insight is that capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed without labor. So labor is actually the primary force of progress, not necessarily capital. In fact, this is an idea perhaps stolen by Karl Marx, but he got carried away with a bunch of other ideas. But the point is that this is actually observed by Abraham Lincoln, that capital is not capital, but it's labor that is the primary source of capital. And in fact, if we look at Western progress as what Michael Novak was talking about, it's bottom-up, it's individual private property, etc. But all of that actually came through tools that people used in Europe over the last 1,000 years that gave rise to economic empowerment, and they made governments accountable because the lack of capital in the hands of monarchs. So it's not empowering the monarchs or the king of the country from outside capital. That is not the source of progress. I say this in the town where the World Bank is. I used to work there. The point is, you don't empower governments with capital, but you empower citizens and allow them to create capital is actually the real source of progress. So in 1993, I used to work in a small investment firm in New York, and my network broke down. And this accidental breakdown suddenly brought all these ideas together in my mind. Otherwise, frankly, I didn't quite see them getting connected. So what happened is that I used to work in a small investment firm, and our computers were connected. And we got more efficient because we didn't have to exchange floppy disks. It's nice to see people matured age here, some that floppy disks. In the young population, often they have never heard of it. But anyway, it got really more efficient. But as it broke down, I was waiting for someone to come and fix the network. But this reminded me of a day in 1971 when Bangladesh was separating from Pakistan, what is now just Pakistan, and we hid in a rural area where there was less violence. And my mother sent me to get some medicine for a younger sibling about 10 kilometers away. So as a 13-year-old, I walked all morning to get there. When I got there, the medicine man wasn't there. So I walked all afternoon back. And so I remember another unproductive day as I was sitting in New York, a tall building that I had in a rural Bangladesh. And I basically concluded that connectivity is productivity. If you connect people, you enable them. If you disconnect them, you disable them. So then I suddenly realized that it's not the computers that would be the solution that I had originally thought in the 1980s. But it's this, that now that the Moore's law is going to govern the cell phone as well, okay? And the cell phones are actually connected computers, and voice communication is simply one of the applications, perhaps the killer app, okay? So anyway, then I actually went back and dug into Adam Smith more. And the interest, and he has a whole long list of things that come out of specialization and exchange. One of them is inclusion. How would I specialize unless I cede activities to others? So for instance, I could start with activities A, B, C, D, E, but I must give A to Adam, B to Beth, C to Kathy, D to David, etc., in order to focus on E. So what I'm saying is specialization and exchange has many beauties. One of them is inclusion, because I cannot specialize unless I cede activities to others, okay? But then Adam Smith, of course, makes another point. There's hardly anything he didn't see, actually. But his point is the division of labor must always be limited to the extent of the market. So how you communicate, whether through a river or a highway or through cell phone communication, whatever it is, as you expand the market through means of communication, you expand the possibilities of specialization. Because if I simply want to, let's say, I seed farming to other people and I become a fisherman, then I must seed further other kinds of fish to other people and focus just on, let's say, salmon. Because unless I have a big market, I cannot do that. So the bigger the market, more specialization possible, and more inclusion will happen. So that is the reason inclusion is fundamentally connected to connectivity. So what I realized is that it is possible to conceive of a very low-income country at the time. At the time, Bangladesh had GDP per capita of only $250 per year. And the cell phone, this is talking about 93, were $500. I mean, you may not have seen it because they subsidized the phone when you took a subscription. But actual cost of the device was close to $500. So the point is, I believed in the Moore's law that it will go down in price. And on the demand side, as people become more productive, they will be able to afford it. So people's purchasing power will go up, and the prices will come down. Somewhere it will make work. I mean, it will work. That is how I went forward and plunged into it, leaving the United States. But I faced many experts as I was trying to convince others. So I had to find ways to ward off the experts. So let me explain what happened. So one is that poor countries are under-resourced. So therefore, you cannot have these very high-tech, latest digital technologies there. Remember, again, I'm talking about 22, 23 years ago. So one of the things, poor countries are under-resourced. And I started arguing, no, poor countries are very, very wasteful. So for instance, I was wasting time. And the time, America has 24 hours a day, Bangladesh has 24 hours a day. If we waste time, then obviously we'll fall behind America. So it's a different perspective that you have to adopt to create this kind of ventures so that they are more wasteful, and we need to see how we can minimize those wastes. Second is the poor people lack the buying power. But productivity tools, we don't have to think about that. You know, the American history, if you look, Isaac Singer introduced sewing machines, okay? And he, in fact, innovated also with his partner, somebody named Clark, as to how to finance them. But sewing machines made people more productive, and then they were able to pay for the sewing machines. They were very expensive about 150 years ago. And so, in fact, then the other point is that you have the tools have to be affordable. And this I also disagree. Like all of us need banking services in this country, but you don't need to buy a bank yourself. Somebody can buy a bank and provide a service to a whole community. So it could be a business for somebody, and it could be a service for other people. Experts also told me that we must first focus on primary needs. In a poor country, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, these are much more important than some high-tech digital phones. Okay. Those were yuppie devices in this country at the time. There are few percentage of people in America had cell phones. So my point is, I don't think we need to think about that. What is really the primary need is higher income. Because when people have higher income, they engage their brains how to spend it. We don't have to be the big brothers to decide whether they should buy food or shelter or whatever. In fact, by the way, this is another interesting thing that is wasted if you are poor, because your brain is wasted. And the brains, everybody has one, nobody has two, nobody has none. So this is another important resource that's wasted. So what I figured out that after I managed to outconvince the experts, I realized that the main key is how can I distribute it rapidly. And like the internet was spreading very quickly in America, and they were spreading because people already had computers. People already had modem. People already had telephone lines, many other things that this rides on. So in a poor country, again, partly because of aid, these countries are centralized, okay, in the centralized governments. And vast rural areas in the surrounding areas are totally underdeveloped, okay? There's very few other things to ride a new thing on. And this is why I started focusing on Grameen Bank. That was a bank giving poor people loans for various, and I realized that maybe I could make them a client. They could, they had about 1,000 branches, and these branches could be places where I could put cell towers, etc. But they were not really that interested because they have, after all, developed in a country that didn't have telecommunication for all practical purposes. At this point, by the way, 1 out of 500 people had a phone in Bangladesh. And those are generally fixed phones. And so I realized that I need to focus on what Grameen Bank does. And because they had a tremendous rural presence, and otherwise I couldn't go to the rural areas. And I realized because of Moore's law, the economics will work out vis-a-vis the rural areas. And so the Grameen Bank had a simple formula. They gave a loan to usually a poor woman who could borrow money and buy a cow, but it could be a goat loan, it could be a duck loan, but usually it's a cow loan. And the cow gives milk, she sells the milk in the village and pays off the loan. And then I proposed that, a cell phone could be a cow, because they could give a loan to someone and get a phone, and the whole community get the phone service, and they pay off the loan, keeping a margin, and it could be just a business for her. And then I went back to Grameen Bank and I said, I think the cell phone can be a cow. And they said, this is a little crazy, but somewhat logical. So they said, if you think that can happen, then come and make it happen. At this point, I quit my job in New York, and I went back, and I worked pretty much 4 years to, but I thought about a dovetailing position that how things would come together. So Grameen Bank would provide a distribution capacity through these women borrowing money to buy phones and providing a service. And I needed a telephone company that could provide the know-how, because I frankly had no experience in telecommunications. And the government would give licenses, and perhaps we need some initial capital from some sources like IFC, part of the World Bank. And so I spent 4 years trying to put this together. For the sake of saving time, I will not go into the details, but it involved 4 years, many sleepless nights, 1,000,000 miles in frequent flyer miles, some minor loss of hair, but I got together a consortium of these bodies that we then created Grameen Phone. And at one point, it had 300,000 women selling services to 100 million people. And it now has 55 million subscribers, but at this point, virtually all adults have phones in the country. And it's a very successful industry, not just Grameen Phone, other competitors have come in, and the country has, for its level of income, is ahead in mobile telephony. But I'll show you a simple point. At this point, Grameen Phone has spent more than $3.5 billion in building infrastructures. But initial capital was 120 million. When all those forces came together, then they invested. But that is only 3.4% of the $3.5 billion. Where did this rest of the money come from? Labor getting converted. So people are getting more productive, okay? They're better coordinated, 100 million, 150 million people coordinating the activities better. They are paying a service, so they're paying maybe few pennies because they are advancing by a quarter, by $1 for the value of time and other things. So, and then that gives rise to billions of dollars of revenues coming out of those millions of people, okay? And that revenue has profits, then they invest. And even the first $120 million also came by showing that there will be profits in the future. So what I'm trying to say, the actual, the infrastructure has been built by the people of Bangladesh. And that is the point, that how can we help countries emerge? They're rich in labor, by the way, okay? So introduce productivity tools that they can embrace, I think is the key. And so, and that dovetails the interest of citizens, of providers of the tools, a business, and the government, and maybe even rich countries that can export those tools. So all interests come together and hang together. To illustrate that point, let me show you another point. That this, now people recognize that Bangladesh has been transformed by this, but the Norwegian telephone company that came along in this consortium, what happened to them? How are they doing? Any idea? No, they didn't go out of business. Look at this. The Telenor was reluctant to come to Bangladesh. This is the first Asian country they came to. And subsequently, their 52% of their revenues have now become from Asian sources. And in fact, they made me this, I don't know how good your Norwegian is, but they made me the door opener to Asia. I mean, at least they didn't make me the doorman. But I introduced them to Asia, so this was in like 2 years ago, there was an article, okay? So what I'm trying to say, Telenor is transformed also. It's not just Bangladesh that's transformed. Telenor is transformed. It had no business in Asia at the time. Now it is a country Norway is a country of 5 million people, and it has 200 million subscribers in Asia, okay? And so this mutual transformation is possible between the first world and the third world, and mutual economic interests. Now, actually, Bangladesh, I dare say, gives aid to Norway, because hundreds of millions of dollars of dividends going back to Norway, much, much bigger than Norway ever gave aid to Bangladesh. And that's the way it should be. Bangladesh is a big country, warm country, can help out a small, cold country over there. So what I'm trying to say, that's the kind of mutual interest we need to see. Now, then, of course, just like microfinance gave rise to the provision of telecommunication, it's now possible that all those mobile phones can also give rise to other services. So these insights can come together, and we may be able to see the world in a new light. Thank you very much.
Absolutely terrific.
No, thank you.
Amazing.
No, thank you very much.
I just want to, once again, thank you very, very much, Iqbal, for that incredible presentation. It is now a real pleasure to introduce as well Dr. Carl Schramm. Dr. Schramm, for the last 10 years, has been the CEO and president of the Kauffman Foundation, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. For those of you who are aware of the Kauffman Foundation, you know they're all about entrepreneurship. And it is Dr. Schramm's work which has really advanced the cause of entrepreneurship, not just through the foundation, but the good work that the foundation has done in educational establishments and elsewhere to advance the cause of entrepreneurship. In fact, his work was so successful that the Economist a few years ago called him the evangelist of entrepreneurship. Dr. Schramm, prior to going to the Kauffman Foundation, had a professorship at Johns Hopkins University in hospital management and finance. He also was the founder and directed the program of hospital management and financing there at Johns Hopkins University. He has lectured all over the place around the world and really has been a champion in the cause of entrepreneurship. He's going to be talking to us about how Catholic social teaching can advance entrepreneurship in the world today. I don't think we can get a better expert for that. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Carl Schramm.
Very much. Thank you. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Despite my totally German name, I'm half Irish and a citizen of Ireland. I'm very nervous as an economist to speak to an audience that includes theologians, and particularly Michael Novak. When I took over the Kauffman Foundation, a post from which I've been retired for 4 years. I'm now a professor at Syracuse. His inspirational book, The Fire of Invention, coupled with Thomas Sowell's book, The Vision of the Anointed, became the canon of our revision of philanthropy, which I'd like to think influenced many other foundations. With that said, let me begin. In the 125 years since Leo XIII commenced modern instruction by the Church on economic matters, the instigation of new business has never received much direct attention. Trade and commerce have always been seen consistently through the lens of large corporations, through the government, and its impact on working people. The creative act of entrepreneurs in bringing about a changed economic order has largely been ignored. As a result, the Church has missed a great opportunity to embrace economic growth as an instrument of social justice. Wealth has always been concentrated. In fact, America has played a critical role in shifting the nature of wealth concentration, democratizing wealth making from the nation's very beginning. Our democracy's foundation enshrines God's plan for the flourishing of individuals as the key to communities where human dignity prevails. These principles, unique to our founding, link the role of the secular state to advancing God's plan more than any nation founded before or since. Critically, the state is created to be the servant of individuals whose inherent goodness relates to being children of God. Thus it has been since the Pilgrims declared in the Mayflower Compact and Winthrop envisioned a city of civic paradise as an exemplar to all governments. Ours was to be exceptional from its beginning, a city set upon a hill. The country was to be a moral beacon from its conception. Jefferson instructs the British and the world on our biblically formed claim to a separate existence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The 56 signatories to the Declaration might be said to have authored the first American encyclical. It was intentionally meant to speak to the world's aspirations for self-government based on the centrality of the individual. Salvation is an individual calling by Jesus, and the state is seen protecting individual conscience as the vital element of its foundation. Both Jefferson's utopian vision of a nation of farmers and yeomen without evil cities and the antithetical view of contemporaries Hamilton and Franklin, who saw the American founding as a broader political and economic experiment, required the holding of private property by the individual. Private property was critical if law was to be based in morality. And in our Constitution, we defined for the first time a completely different vision, so important to entrepreneurs, of what private property might include. It was intellectual property in the patent clause. It was the explosion of human creativity created by the freedom that Hamilton and Franklin saw as the potential of America. They expected that when individual invention could flourish in a free society, a new economy of unimagined things would result. This would displace the concentration of wealth based on land that was the rule of Europe. Landed estates, aristocratic order, entails, primogeniture were the tools of preserving concentrated wealth that were hiding in plain sight. They blinkered the medieval church, whose claim to secular power was measured by its temporal domains. The perspective that wealth was concentrated by God's plan bothered the Democrats designing the new republic. They were sons of the Enlightenment. If there was to be a revolution of human creativity, it would rest on freedom, that in turn would recognize individual achievement, merit, economic competency, industriousness, and innovation. These would be the forces that would eliminate the high and the mighty. The number of landowners in America's future would make the concept of government by liege lords unthinkable. What might be called the scale success of America's version of the English Industrial Revolution, driven in large measure by the enormity of her continental markets and fueled by the near absence in the American consciousness of any central governing authority from which permission needed seeking, shook the world concept of economic progress. Without an ingrained notion that there was a socioeconomic hierarchy that required obeisance, individuals could pursue commercial activity as never before. The world's immigrants described America's streets as paved with gold. The metaphor just speaks of any individual's right to leverage his freedom. Fortunes could be made by any of God's children. In a few decades, the world's richest men of English, German, Irish, and English descent, those whose wealth was not connected to the land, were to be found in the United States. America set the pace for economic growth from the dawn of the 19th century onwards. She excelled in instrumentation, mass production, and innovations in sales using her vast railroad network. But this economic progress was concentrated in her rapidly growing cities, where the disparities of wealth were now plain to see, where the rich lived lavishly and publicly, and the poor were huddled in tenements. Yet largely lost to modern-day historians, while the conditions were appalling in absolute sense and in relative terms, immigrants continued to pour into America for the same reasons they do today. The American promise was, and largely still is, better and more open than the civic and commercial orders prevailing in Europe, Asia, or with the exception of Canada, still in the rest of the Americas. Whatever faults the American economic system has, it continues to offer more opportunity to rise in economic status than any other economy. As we worry about the slowing upward mobility and opportunity, the causes of which are mirrored in falling rates of entrepreneurship, to which I'll speak in a second, even today, large numbers of Americans are still capable and still climb from poverty to the upper 1% in their lifetimes. We all know people whose histories look like this. Indeed, just last week, in returning a card to Maryland, my dear friend at the San Francisco Hertz office, as usual, checking in my car, she bragged on her two children, one a law student at Stanford, the other a postdoc in biology at Berkeley. It's my story, it's your story. Indeed, it is largely devolved on America by accident that it was to be the world school for economic development. After the Civil War, her ascent among world commercial powers commenced in earnest. Cheaper, better, and more innovative goods reflected her great resource, namely her diverse and industrious peoples working in a shared civic religion of freedom. In both world wars, its wealth and its industry played the pivotal role in preserving Western culture. It is no stretch to say that entrepreneurial capitalism preserved the two great Western traditions in religion. Only 3 decades ago, it saw to the ending of socialist communism, the greatest threat to the continued existence of the church and its ability to proclaim the redemptive promise of Jesus into the future. In every instance, new economic freedoms emerged in the freed lands, and economic progress was undeniably sparked. America proved Adam Smith's mystery of capitalism. Any society's welfare is increased by the exertions of as many individuals seeking their own economic self-interest as possible. This rhetorical construct at first always sounds like a near occasion of sin, if not a sinful attitude itself. But puzzle through its consequences. In the last 20 years alone, over 1 billion people have been lifted from poverty by economic growth as both China and India consciously abandoned their operational commitment to centrally planned communist economic systems. This fact, both its cause and effect, is beyond dispute. The second mystery of entrepreneurial capitalism can only now be recognized. It is that it has worked better before it was seen for what it is. Prior to 1980, the word was seldom used in America or elsewhere. Those of you familiar with Italian know the clumsy neologism of imprenditore. It doesn't work. The phenomena works, the word doesn't. The word entrepreneur was never heard, seldom heard, and before it was used, individuals with a new idea naturally started businesses at higher rates. This was seldom remarked upon when people started a business. It was an unrecognized phenomenon in our capitalist system. Imagine how little we knew of it. It was not until 2006 that the Kauffman Foundation published research that showed that 90% of all jobs created in the United States were in businesses less than 5 years old. The power in the engine of entrepreneurship was never recognized by economists. It is no surprise then that the Catholic social doctrine was and is largely silent on entrepreneurship. Historically, the church has been nervous about commerce in general. John Chrysostom was of the view that merchants, whom Adam Smith saw as the original entrepreneurs, committed sin by transacting business. Then, with industrialism, came the threat of socialism as a theory of government. The church, as we know, instinctively rejected its tenet that all property belonged to the state as a custodian for all. The 8th and 10th commandments speak respectively of the act and the attitude of contemplating human relationships devoid of property rights. Worse, socialism's claim that public and private morality are identical and that the state has the power to declare a moral code different from that of revelation was an anathema to the church. In fact, it was the conflict between workers and factory owners in America, in the economy where industrialism was most advanced, that helped lead Leo to Rerum Novarum. In there, Leo affirmed the rights of private property and largely adopted the emergent American progressive vision of political economics, itself indebted to Bismarck as a bulwark against socialism. To progressive then and now, entrepreneurial capitalism is a second-best solution. It was the pragmatism of James Cardinal Gibbons, the primate of America's first see in Baltimore, whose life project was constructing a Catholic communion that fit the American context, successfully engineered a firewall against European-style Socialist Labor Party in the United States. Leo wisely saw America's unique economic identity and potentiality through the eyes of Cardinal Gibbons. The entrepreneur has never been valued in progressive economics. His or her potential to disrupt incumbent businesses, a favored actor in the model preferred by progressives of a state-planned economy where experts regulated business, the entrepreneur was most unwelcome. The progressive gospel in America, articulated first by Wilson and then by FDR, established big government as the rational, cool-headed mediator most capable of seeing what was in society's best interests. The rule of the people was displaced by the prejudices of expert technocrats. As suggested, government's effective authority derived from its partnership with big labor and big business, a trilateral agreement engineered by progressives. This rational model appealed to the church. It promised, without basis, predictable economic growth with increases in welfare that socialism and communism could not deliver. Necessarily, interest in the individual's economic initiative was subordinated to an enlightened government paternalism. Vatican II reflected this economic theory in Gaudium et Spes, where the trilateral arrangement of owners, organized labor, and government was confirmed. This three-power arrangement continues to take its authority from John Maynard Keynes, whose general theory furnishes an explicit slander of the disruptive entrepreneur. Keynes, in the general theory, says, by Keynes, ever the aristocrat. You can see my American coming out, right? Sees the entrepreneur as greedy, an opportunist, and a rent seeker. His text all but whispers perfidious. The entrepreneur's exertions threaten the incumbency of big firms. Schumpeter's antithetical view that entrepreneurs provided needed creative destruction required for macroeconomic growth has never gained favor in policy. It promises unpredictability, something progressive economists cannot tolerate, even as they cannot deliver its opposite when relying on Keynesian mechanics, namely predictable growth. And so the church would remain silent on the role of the entrepreneur until miraculously, St. John Paul II, writing in Solitude Re Socialis in 1983, introduced the word entrepreneur to the literature of papal encyclicals. The Pope saw entrepreneurs as enterprise as an activity of God the Creator, who fashioned man in his image, and the entrepreneur is playing a special creative act in God's plan. Like God himself, who made the world of nothing, the entrepreneur fashions an immaterial idea into a company, and the existentialist phrase, a concrete essence, that serves humankind with its products and creates jobs with the promise of providing dignity to other workers. John Paul gave witness to both dimensions in his speech to entrepreneurs in Milan, where he said, and I quote, "The degree of well-being the society enjoys today would have been impossible without the dynamic figure of the entrepreneur, whose function consists in organizing human labor and the means of production in order to produce goods and services." He went on in his second pastoral letter, Centesimus Annus, to observe, quote, "Organizing such a productive effort, planning its duration and time, making sure it corresponds in a positive way to the demands which it must satisfy, and taking the necessary risks. All this is a source of wealth in today's society." The pontiff understood that in helping to generate society's wealth, the basis of all of our welfare, the role of the entrepreneur is critical. The entrepreneur is Aristotle's prime mover in the economy. Unfortunately, John Paul II's vision appears but an incandescent moment, apart from the weight of the magisterium that has been accreting since Rerum Novarum. I find it odd that the Church's evolving teachings on economics spring root and branch from the soil of secular humanism. Several American economists who proclaim their role as counselors to the Vatican include prominent spokesmen for governments everywhere, subjugating individual economic initiatives to technical experts who know best where to deploy economic resources. The compendium, taken as a whole, suggests the weight of Catholic social policy sees the state as both competent and duty-bound to plan the economy. It transfers the same credence to international organizations. One statement from Article 351 pertaining to economic institutions and the action of the state makes the point. I quote, "Solidarity without subsidiarity, in fact, can easily generate into a welfare state, while subsidiarity without solidarity runs the risk of encouraging forms of self-centered localism." I think the Anglo, to quote George, would be isolated nationalism. In order to respect both, again I quote, "In order to respect both of these fundamental principles, the state's intervention in the economic environment must be neither invasive nor absent, but commensurate with society's real needs." Now, silence follows on the critical question of who decides. But the rest of the compendium inevitably suggests government elites have the answer. Making social justice not the same thing as nurturing a just society inevitably becomes an active matter of public budgeting, one that is necessarily focused on what is fashionably described as distributive justice. It's clear for sure that I am not a theologian. To some in both tribes, it's not clear I'm an economist or qualify as a lawyer. So let me retreat to positive analysis of today's topic, namely entrepreneurs. In the United States, government policymakers are largely uninterested in one of the most important indicators of continued decay in our economy. I could say these same things for policymakers in the EU. The number of new businesses being started has fallen to an all-time low. Fewer than 500,000 new businesses start annually in the United States, down from over 700,000 but 10 years ago. The decline in new business starts has been underway for more than 20 years, but has accelerated abruptly since 2008 and continues to slide. This slide is related to government expanding its reach through regulation into the affairs of every business. One of the saddest things I've encountered in the last 4 years is coaching young entrepreneurs at the university, one coming up with a good idea and saying to me, "Do you think the government will let us do this?" That story tells of how invidious this notion of government control over even our thinking has become. Again, referring to the slide, in entrepreneurs related to the expansion of government regulation. But it is even more related to the expanding share of GDP claimed by government. Let us look at one such use of funds and the church's, what I see to be naive position on the matter. The compendium encourages more spending to correct poverty. It sanctions redistributive justice. But be alert to the immorality of the progressive Keynesian solution justified by such doctrines when they are put in practice. Since the Great Recession, America and virtually every country in the EU have funded expanding expanding social welfare programs by laying debt on future generations. This practice is at least as immoral as paying no heed to the suffering of the poor at all, because it is certain to impoverish more people in the future. Likewise, a reckless monetary policy that favors incumbent corporations denies the society the capacity to grow faster through the efforts of entrepreneurs who instigate what Schumpeter called creative destruction. In the end, economic growth, as uneven, as unpredictable as it is, favoring some more than others, individuals and nations alike, is the best path to expanding welfare for God's human family. Perhaps the inherently unequal outcomes of the process is why the compendium is so silent on economic growth per se. This is a dangerous place for the church to be. Growth, the undeniable reason that 6/7 of the world's population lives beyond the dehumanizing conditions of poverty, is itself suddenly under attack. This is incomprehensible, but true. What can explain this hostility to growth? Socialism has never delivered growth in any of its grand experiments. To witness this fact leads to admitting the success of capitalism, as imperfect as it is. A recently developed variant of the assault on capitalism is that in its quest for growth, it cannot but despoil the planet. Environmental protection appears as a newly discovered concern of mankind. But two realities must be considered. Capitalism has self-correcting powers like socialism cannot dream of. Entrepreneurs play a role in this feature of capitalism. They force the system to be more efficient and to be more effective and to be more innovative. Consider that since 1972 in the United States, every unit of American gross domestic product has been made with fewer units of carbon. This reality is not a mistake. It is the handiwork of entrepreneurs and engineers working steadily to improve our environment since the 1970s. Many of these entrepreneurs and engineers, if not most, consider themselves called to a vocation. They are humble servants of God. They awake every day to better use the earth's resources in more sustainable ways. They knowingly serve the human family as their vocation. Apart from their uses in reducing carbon-based fuels, it is their innovations that have permitted us to dream of the alternative and more effective uses of solar and wind power. These are not the result of the ministrations of policy experts. I conclude by observing that innovators and entrepreneurs are blessed with a unique charism. To the extent that contemporary church supports government that effectively suppress business creation, using regulations and taxes that slow economic expansion, the full flowering of human creativity and welfare will never be realized. The potentiality that resides in every individual will be retarded in its development. The road to salvation will be made harder. Let us pray to the Holy Spirit that we may see a just and moral way forward in this complex morass. Perhaps the Holy Spirit will provide us with an entrepreneurial solution. Thank you.